Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 1, Part 11, instead of Epilogue. Read by Natalia Buzova. 40 years have passed, and only in recent years it was possible to learn something about the death of a cadet platoon, which was hushed up, and to tell the bitter truth about it. In Soviet times, it was customary to talk about victories, but it was strictly forbidden to talk about losses, about mediocre command, about the inhuman use of a soldier. Then, in Pyatigorsk, the underestimated and deliberately information about the enemy just landing was not just erroneous, but deliberate. It was embedded in our minds in order to maintain our fighting spirit and confidence in victory, and we, trusting our commanders, were eager for the earliest possible destruction of the enemy landing. As they say, we're on the rampage while showing ostentatious bravado. We were young then, hot, ideologically stuffed, ready to go into fire and water. And of course, we tried to excel before the graduation. Even today, I'm not ashamed of this striving, for it's through us not to parade, but to meet death. Our platoon detachment, carrying out the order for reconnaissance, ran into the regular units of the enemy, unable to either overturn it or move away. The fight was fleeting, hot, and uneven. The cadets, especially at the beginning, showed their skill and courage, but the forces were unequal, and they fell on the field of battle. What was happening then in other companies? Why did they not support us? I learned about that only 43 years later from the former platoon commander, Senior Lieutenant Pavel Kornevich Vdovchenko. Here is what he said. Near Mashuk, I headed the advanced detachment of the 14th Company. We passed the upper part of the cemetery, kicked out the German guard posts, but then we could not shoot down their firing points on the way to the crossing, without which it was impossible to turn to the city outskirts. The 15th Company also got stuck in a skirmish with the Germans near the forestry. We saw how the 13th Company fought on the outskirts, how the stacks were burning, but due to the circumstances, we could not help it. Having used up the cartridges, the 14th and 15th Companies, losing the killed and wounded, retreated through the wooded area beyond the Podkumok. And the part of our company that had remained near the town at the disposal of the executive officer Gava was suddenly attacked by submachine gunners who had approached from the city. In the battle, our platoon commander of the second rank, Nikolai Gava, the platoon assistant commander, Sergeant Aziz Vasigo, as well as several cadets became intrepid heroes. The rest went to Praval. They were virtually unarmed. The cadets of the lower town were also unsuccessful. They only tried to attack the Germans in the morning, having crossed the river, but were driven back and suffered losses. In general, what was characteristic of the first period of the war happened in Pyatigorsk. The Germans, having an overwhelming advantage in weapons, burst into the city suddenly when they were not expected there, and nobody was ready to repulse. A day earlier, the Moscow radio reported that the battles, and as always fierce, were still going on in the Armyr region. Someone had sent that encouraging information to the headquarters in order to somehow justify the forced impedance to stop the enemy, being obviously already in Nalchik. Was it justified to throw almost unarmed school graduates against an enemy armed KPP? We didn't ask about it then. Throwing, then it was necessary. And today, I would like to remove this issue from discussion, expel it from my aching memory, bury it deeper, and throw stones at the grave. But it is tenacious, especially in the memory of those who then lost many comrades in arms and themselves, by mistake or accident, survived in order to carry these aching wounds of war all their lives. There is such a concept, inevitable losses, and no matter how hard they are, such losses do not cause feelings of protest, reproaches of conscience, but on one condition, if their effectivity is significant and extremely necessary. An example of it is the feat of a group of cadets under the command of Lieutenant Pestov, who burst into the city on the Komsomolets tractor and inflicted significant damage on the enemy in manpower and equipment. We bare our heads in front of the greatness of the spirit of those who, at the cost of their own lives, nevertheless brought victory closer. But there is another concept, useless sacrifices. They most often took place in those cases when adventurous attempts were made to save the situation and their own heads, to evade responsibility for their own and others' miscalculations in the implementation of combat, sometimes unbearable tasks and orders of the High Command. How many of our brothers were killed, especially during the first period of the war? At least with the feats only, but forward. That was the motto generated by Stalin's adventurers. Unfortunately, at that difficult and cruel time, all orders, one harder than the other, were often given in a hurry and at random without taking into account the real forces and capabilities. To take at any cost, defend, attack, that was their main content. People were not spared. The more they fell, it meant that the battles were hotter and the greater the merits of the command. Such actions were most often pushed by an unexpected breaks in the front line and unsuccessful military operations, and hence the fear of supreme anger and punishment no less than a firing squad, and the ordinary soldier paid for everything. In Petigorsk, the school lost in only one day 5 lieutenants and 1 junior political instructor, as well as about 100 cadets who were killed. Many were injured, left in the dark on the battlefield, and died in captivity. Some were in a mousetrap, and the road to the school was already closed for them. Meanwhile, 2 days after the fall of the city, our radio still broadcast to the whole country an encouraging lie that there were fierce battles in Petigorsk and that the troops of General Timofeyev, not a word about the cadets of the school, destroyed 5 tanks, 50 cars, and more than 100 Nazis. The information was shamelessly overstated, and it was sent to headquarters on behalf of the same general who threw us against the tanks in order to somehow shield himself. In 1944, at her request, my mother received a notification from the school that Cadet Ivan Ivanovich Pavlenko had gone missing on the North Caucasian front in October 1942. Probably the parents of other cadets received the same news. Yes, there was no one not only to bury the fallen and pick up the wounded, but also to report the truth about our fate. The commander of our detachment, Lieutenant Nikitenko, died a heroic death. Our platoon commander, the second-rank military technician Gava, died in an unequal battle, but Captain Bykov returned to the school, received the Order of the Red Star and the rank of major, became the commander of a new recruitment cadet battalion. What did he prove when he returned to school? probably how heroically he led the battle in Pyatigorsk. However, after his order, no one saw him there again. Having imposed the duties on Senior Lieutenant Mordashov, accompanied by a guard of 4 cadets, he immediately retreated beyond the Patkuma. It was not in his interest to report the deaths of our platoon, which he had sent into a trap without preliminary reconnaissance, just blindly. And the school authorities, who before us had been in the deep rear, also found it more convenient to write off their unjustified losses to the troops of General Timofeyev. That is why we died not on August the 10th in the city of Pyatigorsk, but in October on the North Caucasian front. Look for, but in vain, when the front stretches for 1,000 kilometers from the Black to the Caspian Seas. So the platoon that had accomplished the feat was consigned to oblivion. But I, having gone through the hellish circles of captivity, survived. Maybe 1 in 30. Immediately upon returning from captivity, I tried to tell about the heroic and tragic fate of my comrades, but they pulled me back, obviously seeing the blame for the death of the platoon in the existing military doctrine. Not knowing where the school was, I wrote to the main armored directorate of the Red Army. After a while, I was summoned to the district military enlistment office, looked at with suspicious eyes, and explained that millions had died, and I had better not write, but go to the collective farm and raise it from the ruins in order to atone for my stay in captivity. I left the military registration and enlistment office in some kind of deranged state. I wandered along the street, and it all seemed that on my forehead was burning not the scar from the muzzle of the German pistol that had hit me during the interrogation by the Hitlerite officer, but the stigma of a leper. What could be the state of a person who, instead of gratitude for the blood and torment of captivity, was thrown a stone in his face, spit in his soul? Having gone through all the hellish cycles of captivity, I survived and returned to my homeland, which I loved and shed blood for it, but it turned her back on me. Having survived, I did not want to live, and I hid, became embittered, fell silent for many years, becoming politically two-faced, opportunistic, but with a strong thirst for truth-seeking. The only kind doctor healer saved me in those years. That was labor on the land that had given birth to me, nursed me, and once already put me on my feet. And also my fellow villagers, themselves more than once crumpled and beaten by life, but who had not lost their humanity, kindness, and sympathy. In their midst, I was reborn to lay the foundation for the life of a completely different person, cautious, secretive, hating Stalinism, but then living according to its wolfish laws. Only on the eve of the 40th anniversary of the victory, I could not resist, and through the press began to look for comrades in arms. Over the course of the year, I found the council of the school veterans and many former cadets and commanders, but no one from our 2nd platoon of the 13th company who had taken part in the battle for Pyatigorsk was found. I also found the family of Captain Bykov in Kiev, but he himself was no longer alive. He had died with the rank of colonel. I sent my memories of the Pyatigorsk events to the Council of Veterans. After that, I was invited to Poltava and introduced to the editorial board for the preparation of a collection of memoirs about the military past of the school. And I plunged into work. A lot of archival documents with bitter truths and boasting lies, as well as memoirs and letters of veterans passed through my hands. On their basis, with the help of Colonel Kirillov, I wrote 2 books. There was such a regiment, about the consolidated regiment of the school that fought on the Dnieper in 1941, and Defense of Petigorsk. But prepared for publication, they never came out of print. The times of perestroika restructuring came, and the need for such literature disappeared. In addition, Colonel Kirillov died. Among the many letters accumulated in the Council of Veterans, the letter of the former cadet of our platoon, Pyotr Stepanovich Tibeykin, from the Tashkent region, was especially valuable for me. In it, he informed the chairman of the Council of Veterans, Ulyanchenko, that he knew nothing about the existence of the council. So in May 1980, he had sent a request to the first secretary of the Petigorsk City Committee of the CPSU, whether the memory of the cadets of the 2nd Platoon of the 13th Company who had died on the outskirts of the city on the night of August 9-10, 1942 was immortalized. A list of the fallen was attached to the letter. I took the letter for myself and kept it as a precious relic, for in the list under number 14, there was my surname, and opposite it, there was a mark, killed. In 1986, I gave the letter to the Petigorsk Museum at the request of its employees. I also have a list of cadets and commanders whose names were engraved on the military memorial in Petigorsk in 1975. From our platoon, there were only 3 people in it: Lieutenant Nikitenko, Senior Sergeant Vasigov, and Cadet Tesluk. How did they get there? I don't know. There are 19 people on the list. These are the fallen in different places. They were buried by our people, moreover, where a bullet or a splinter overtook them. Some, like junior political instructor Maximov, in a hastily dug grave at a cemetery, others in a natural pit or a ravine from the rain, and some did not have time to be buried at all. But the surviving commanders knew about their deaths, and at their request for the 30th anniversary of the victory, the names of the fallen were carved on memorial plates. The cadets of our platoon, and with them the 2nd rank military technician Gava, were buried in a common mass grave at the top of the cemetery as unnamed during the German occupation. They were buried by local residents with the participation of a priest. Allegedly, mortal medallions were found at Tesluk and Vasigov, and Lieutenant Nikitenko was recognized by his wife. The rest lie unidentified in a mass grave. The grave with the inscription "Unknown Cadets" was kept until 1975, and then the memorial was rebuilt. Famous names were carved on the slabs, and the unknown were raised to the ground. There was no one to stand up for them. I had to start the search early and make inquiries, including visiting Petigorsk. Perhaps with the help of the old-timers, I would have put something in its place. But it was almost impossible to do that in those years. After all, I had been in captivity, which meant almost a traitor. Who would have listened to me, and who would have believed? Then, in special honor were those who had already driven the German westward to the roar of hundreds of batteries, tanks, and aircraft. Such glory was not with us. The cadets of 1941-42 were brought into battles in the most extreme, most difficult cases, when there was already no one and nothing to stop an enemy armed to the teeth. With only rifles in hand, but strong in spirit, they rushed into attacks, and often at the cost of their own lives, held back the enemy for a day or two. It was a feat of a special kind, imperceptible and not advertised, with gunpowder and blood in half. In its honor, no fireworks were sundered, and no awards were handed out. It's hidden sometimes shamefully to this day. The Stalinist system did not like to admit its shortcomings, miscalculations, and especially its crimes. 1986-1989, Pavlenko, end of the first chapter.